Great. Hello and welcome to the event today. You're joining us for Gender, Politics and Scholarship, Feminist Interventions in Middle East and North African Studies. It falls to me to introduce and to welcome everyone to the event today. I'm Katie Natanel. I'm the executive editor for Middle East Report, and I'm a senior lecturer in gender studies at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies, which is at the University of Exeter. But I'm welcoming you on behalf of MERIP, Middle East Research and Information Project, the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University, and the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter, who all came together to create this event today. The event, as you know, is a roundtable on the past, present, and future of feminist approaches to the field of Middle East and North African studies. And it brings together four scholars and two chairs who have played absolutely pivotal roles in shaping the multidisciplinary field of women's and gender studies within studies of the region. And the four scholars will be introduced very shortly by our chairs. This conversation, just so we have some context, has been organized as part of MERIP's upcoming issue on gender and sexuality. And the roundtable transcript will be edited and included within that issue, which is due out in spring. And that will be made available to even more people than could join us online today. So MERIP issues are published online and they're free to access. And the recording of this conversation, the roundtable event, will also be made available by CCAS later. We're going to put the link to our newsletter from MERIP in the chat, and you can sign up or subscribe to stay updated on what MERIP is doing and find out when the issue is going to be published. I'm going to hand over to the chairs in just a second, but I wanted to take the time actually to say, as a student and a scholar of gender, I'm incredibly eager for this issue that MERIP is publishing and for the conversation today. And for me, it really broadly responds to the question, why does gender still matter? So that's not only how scholarship and our fields have taken shape, but why gender matters in this political, social, economic, and historical moment, and what that means for our shared future. So I'm really eager. I cannot wait to hear how our speakers and our chairs respond. And it's just an absolute honor to listen to them and to learn from them together today. One last a bit of housekeeping is that I'd like to thank as well the people who have made this logistically and technically, practically possible. So that's Maria Hanoun, the issue editors for MERIP, that's Fida Adeli, Sabiha Alouche, Maha Nasser, and Hisham Salam, and also Coco Tate for planning the event and again, making it actually physically possible. The format for today is going to be a conversation that's guided by our chairs, who I'll introduce in just a second. And then questions from the audience can go into the Q&A feature on Zoom, which should be enabled and will be indicated shortly in the chat. The last thing for me to do is to introduce our chairs. Nadje Al-Ali is joining us. She is the Robert Family Professor of International Studies and Professor of Anthropology and Middle East Studies at Brown University. And Nadje is joined by Maya Mikdashi, who is an Associate Professor of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and Director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Rutgers University. And that's all from me, and I'm very happy to hand off to Nadje and Maya. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much, Katie. It's amazing to be here. Thank you and the entire team from MERIP of bringing us together. I mean, this is a really special occasion, and I feel really honored to be part of it. So what I'm going to do is very, very briefly, in one line, introduce our panelists, but you'll find the longer bios in the chat. So joining us in conversation today will be Mounira Charrad, who is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Texas in Austin. Suad Joseph, who is Distinguished Research Professor of Anthropology and Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at the University of California, Davis. Deniz Kandiyoti, Emeritus Professor in Development Studies at SOAS University of London. And Judith Tucker, who is Professor Emeritus in History at Georgetown University. Welcome, all of you. Maya, you're going to sort of follow up, but I'm going to sort of kick off the first set of questions, really interested to ask you all about the sort of trajectory of the field. And the field, I mean, sort of gender studies with reference to the Middle East and North Africa. So I'd like to ask you about your sense of the trajectory of the field over the last 50 years. And I'm particularly interested in the kinds of challenges you think the field or you personally encountered vis-a-vis gender studies as sort of the broader field, Middle East studies, and of course traditional disciplines. And that links to really Katie's question, well, what does a gendered lens actually contribute to our understanding of the Middle East and North Africa, and does gender matter? So, Deniz, would you mind starting us off? Please, over to you.
Thank you, Nadje. It's a real pleasure to be with you on such an important occasion with valued colleagues. I think what I'd like to do is sort of zoom out to the broadest context, because I think it would be fair to say that many of us on this panel have had our formative experiences at a point in time where there was no gender studies, there was a focus on women, which was very narrow. And you might remember the first volume that came out in 78, Women in the Muslim World, edited by Keddy and Beck, which was trying to put together the scholarship at the time. And of course, the problem was then that the whole approach was mired in what we later called Orientalism, a sense of Islamic exceptionalism, whereby we were frozen in a debate where women's rights were being read off, as it were, the foundational text of the religion. And this was happening at a time when very interesting debates were going on in the rest of the world about the effects of colonialism, spearheaded, of course, by Latin American dependency theory, which had barely made inroads into the Middle East, which is why Judith Tucker, Women in 19th Century Egypt, and the first issues of MERIP were so important, because they broke with that and brought a fresh political economy perspective to the field for the first time. And then I think that one thing I want to put on the agenda, there is a lot more to say, but we have to remember that the way in which gender studies came into the Middle East field was influenced by at least three sets of influences: social movements, the changing governance structures around gender, and academia. And these were in constant interaction with one another. Now, it is clear that the way in which gender studies and indeed Black studies developed in the Euro-Atlantic region and in the States was as a direct response to social movements, second wave feminism, the civil rights movement. This is not the same genealogy when you step into the Middle East. For that, you have to look at the events following the first International Conference on Women, in which a lot of us were participants, in 1975 in Mexico City. From that point on, the whole issue of women's rights and gender was shaped and appropriated by the UN system, until in 95, gender was actually incorporated into official UNEs, shall we say, with an infrastructure of gender training, gender mainstreaming, etc. The reason I'm mentioning this is because the entire teaching and research infrastructure on women's studies, which then became gender studies, started after the impetus of the 1975 conference. Now, the third leg of this is academia and scholarship. And of course, academia and scholarship was going in different directions. And I just want to say one thing, because I don't want to use up my 5 minutes, is that it is actually, because it became the canon in North America, a lot of people associate the field of gender with post-structuralism and the whole discourse about fluidity of gender, etc. In fact, it has a very different genealogy originally, certainly in terms of influencing global governance institutions. And this was the fact that women-targeted projects were not giving the results expected. And gender was proposed as a concept that was targeting institutions and social relations, a much more materialist approach. So the idea that institutions themselves were gendered, whether we're talking about the market, households, the state, and so on. So this was the first step. This kind of got lost somehow, eventually. So when we say, why does gender matter? I think we have to qualify this by different understandings of gender and different approaches to gender, which have been historically quite distinct. To end my first comment, I will also say that scholarship has been buffeted by events and responded to events. So after the 79 Iranian Revolution, we had a whole long-lasting wave of Islamic feminism. Is it possible to find a feminist voice within Islam? From the 80s onwards, with the Infitah, we had a burst of civil society activism with Muslim actors, and that influenced the scholarship. After 9/11, we had a revival of the colonialism debate and the whole issue of feminism as imperialism. If you recall, indeed, with contributions from Nadje, Lalia, Nicola Pratt looking at Iraq, and Laila Blugod looking at more broadly the Muslim world and Afghanistan, it seemed that we'd gone full circle to the original debates that Laila Ahmed had put on the agenda. And finally, the Arab Spring, which influenced a lot of our scholarship, and now this dire moment of catastrophe, which is unfolding in the region. So I think these elements, to me, form the backbone of the context in which we operate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deniz. Yeah, I wonder, Judith, given that you're a historian and based slightly differently sort of in the US, if you would like to share your reflections on this first set of questions.
Okay, well, Deniz has given us this great overview and a great kind of kickoff here. So perhaps I'll just say a few things that might apply more directly to the discipline of history as such, which I think it shares many of the characteristics that Deniz has raised. Certainly what we've usually term in history, the presentist orientation of many of us in the field, because we are most, if not all of us, very connected and concerned, etc., with what's going on in the region. And there has been so much, as we know, going on in the region in the last decades, so that our scholarship has been, I think, very affected by, the political developments that we have lived through. So having said that, I think we are also, like all scholars, very much part of an intellectual world where we are also influenced by broader intellectual trends. And, as Deniz mentioned, it sort of early on, it was political economy and material history. I know for me, it was like the neo-Marxist trends were extremely important. Deniz kindly referred to my work, but I wasn't alone. I want to say that there were, sort of towering figures, women figures who were working, maybe not so much on the Middle East at the time, but on other regions. And I learned a lot and borrowed a lot from them. Early on, we had this political economy push, and it was very much, I think, in reaction to or in denial of this sort of Orientalist reductionism of women to what Islam says about them. But I do think we threw the baby out with the bathwater in retrospect. And sort of for a while, there was a studied refusal to deal with a culture, I would say, and a religious culture in particular. So, that was that. And I think, as Deniz said, certain events like the Iranian Revolution or like the sort of power of the Islamist movements, political movements, refocused our attention on, coming to terms with a certain local tradition, and also a sense of identity that we would find among many women of the region. So, I mean, I personally was quite influenced by Fatma Mernishi's call, the Moroccan sociologist who kind of raised this call, said, hey, we should really be thinking about revisiting the Islamic tradition and trying to understand better what was actually, what actually happened on a material basis, what was happening, but also how texts were variously interpreted over time. And that influenced a lot of my work as in sort of my post-political economy period, when I was more focused on Islamic texts, particularly juristic texts. Yeah, so what else? I mean, I don't want to say too much else maybe at this point. I think, we're going to talk later about the ways in which our field was in dialogue with other, with gender studies, in my case, with the historical discipline, with the discipline of history. So I'll save those remarks for later.
Thank you, Judith. Well, Suad, you've of course been at the forefront, certainly in North America, of institution building in relation to gender studies and the Association of Middle East Women's Studies. You've been very central, important, as well as the various handbooks in gender studies. So was wondering if you also want to contribute with some of your reflections on the set of questions.
Sure. Deniz and Judith really give us a frame that maybe I'll put kind of specific comments within that very kind of spacious framework that they've given us. And maybe from the perspective of anthropology, because anthropology has been a field that has probably contributed among the most of disciplines to the study of women in the Middle East. But I can start by saying that there was hardly anything in anthropology in the 1970s, which is when my generation and Deniz's generation, and Judith, you were just a couple of years behind us, because I remember meeting you as a graduate student. But there was very little in anthropology. If we take our starting point as 1970, from 1970 to the 1990s, somewhere in the 1990s, most of the work was very ethnographic, on the ground, local, descriptive, very little analysis. But this came after the 1967 war, where there was a general sense of defeat, the defeat of pan-Arab nationalism, the defeat of the states, in some sense, the defeat of the student movements. I mean, that was very much formative for me, because I was at Columbia in 1968 with the student uprising. There was a strong sense of the 1970s and 80s of defeat. The thing that shifted things around in a way was 1978 Edward Said's Orientalism. It itself had very little to say about gender, but Orientalism itself was gendered. And feminists were able to intervene in that conversation and talk more about gender, especially in many ways, even though the student movement in itself was very oddly not so gendered. The women's movement side by side with the student movement brought together, along with the civil rights movement, a global perspective that seeped into Middle East studies. And I agree with Deniz. The 1975 Mexico meeting was a herald of things to come. It was the UN Decade for Women, followed by 1985 Nairobi, 1995 Beijing, and then remember 1979 is CEDAW. So a whole series of conventions, including later the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The Islamic Revolution in '79 triggered an interest in the veil. Women's clothing became the topic of so much of the conversation. But it was very difficult to have conversations with scholars, because very few scholars outside of the Middle East read our work. We were not well read outside of our own community of people. So if you were teaching feminist courses, which I began doing in the 70s, there was very little literature to use. So, when Laila Abu Lugh's book in 1986, Veiled Sentiments, came out, it was really one of the few books that was being used ethnographically. Rosemary Sayeg's work, Peasants to Revolution, 1979, then much later, her 1993, Too Many Enemies, focusing specifically on women, really, and then her, later, her 2007 Voices, began the whole tradition of oral histories. And that became very important in documenting where women were located, because in fact, if you look at gender as the gendered lens as a lens about power. Where are women located in relationship to power? What keeps them there? What are the structures of society, the structures of labor, the structures of the representational discourses? Where are women that are located in relationship to those? What keeps them in those places? Where is resistance? Then understanding women's voices and their oral history tradition that Rosemary very much led was very important. So the 1970s to 1990s was a period of rather descriptive work. I think Judith Tucker's work on history was critical. Deniz's book on women, Islam, and the State brought in focus what has been always, in some sense, my central focus, which is the state. And the fact that it's still relevant today is an indication of how much of a breakthrough that book was. But other books as well, like Judith Petit's work on gender and crisis. There was a generation that came after our older folks. I'll include myself among the older folks. I don't know, Deniz, if you want to join me or not. But I think by the late 1990s, there was a very important turn, looking more at global factors, the state, and I think the work became much more analytical, much more theoretical. And yes, we imported a lot of the theoretical frameworks from feminism in the West, but there was also the recognition that there needed to be indigenous frameworks emerging. Islamic feminism was one, but many of us had certain problems with that. There was certainly a lot of time dedicated to that. But I think the 1990s was the major turn and into the early 21st century in terms of theoretical work, critical analytical work, and the production of phenomenal new generations of scholars who were doing work on women in the Middle East. Post-2000, beginning of the 21st century, I think the fascinating turn was the research on sexualities in the bodies. I think that turn with journals like Hol in Lebanon marks a shift from the very particularistic research that had been a characteristic of the 70s to the 90s and creates an interface that is pretty much on a global stage. So there's been a lot of periodization that has happened in terms of understanding women's research and the women and gender research for the Middle East. But I like the framework of 1970s to 1990s, shifting the 1990s, and then the 1990s to the early 2000s themselves becoming a period bracketed of research on the state and on citizenship and on women's rights, in part generated by the UN Decades on Women, but then the post-20s, 2000s, the body and sexuality and putting women into these larger frames becomes very critical. I want to put in the backdrop also that it's what was happening on the ground in the Middle East, especially in the Arab region, was traumatic, violent, chronic warfare. The Lebanese Civil War, 75 to 1990, the Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 1988, the chronic wars in Yemen, upheaval. We had a democratic republic in Yemen that gets turned over. The 2011 Israeli invasions in Lebanon, occupation of Lebanon for 20 years, the Intifada, first Intifada, the second Intifada, the 2011 revolutions, which are largely defeated. It's a period of time of chronic warfare, chronic violence, chronic dislocation of peoples that at times get reflected in the kind of literature we produce, but I think we have to understand much more clearly what are the politics of knowledge production in periods of that kind of global dislocation in the region, caused both by internal forces as well as regional and global forces.
Yeah, yes. Thank you, Suad, and we'll be coming back to some of these issues. Now, Maya, your work, of course, has been comparative and has also been sort of bridging to the work on North Africa, because so much of what many of us have been doing sort of focused more on the Middle East, and there's a sort of Anglo-Saxon literature. So how is your sense of the trajectory of the field and the significance of gender within it?
Well, thank you, Deniz, Judith, and Suad, and I agree with everything that has been said, and I would like to just add a couple of points from the perspective of my discipline, which is sociology, because I think that sociology is the late comer to the study of gender in the region. And it still is a field that is much less represented than anthropology, history, in particular, political science. So it came to the game late. Now, I want to answer two quick questions. One is, why does a gendered lens matter and what it contributes to the study of the region? And I think the answer to that, to my mind, is very simple, is that the study of gender contributes to the study of any region in the world, including ours. And the issue is, for us, is more that Middle Eastern studies scholars have looked at institutions without paying attention to gender. So a whole generation of scholars had to bring it in. But all institutions are gendered everywhere, and therefore including our region. About sociology, I want, in addition to paying attention to all the developments in the world and the development of the field and the issues that were raised, I want to add 2 points that I think were particularly salient in sociology when scholars started at, let's say, at least in my cohort, in my generation of scholarship, as that we were facing an approach to gender in sociology that made 2 claims that many of us then had to confront. And one claim had to do with feminist agendas have been having to be the same or very similar throughout the world. And those of us who looked at Latin America or the Middle East, or some people about Asia, were confronting that and claiming that this was imposing a definition of what is a feminist agenda to the to the global world in a way that didn't make sense to us, because we were aware that the agendas differed and they could be feminist while being different. So the issue of agenda was key. Another issue that was dominant at the time had to do with the relationship between state and gender, and the claim that that the state is patriarchal. Again, blanket statements, and some of us agreed that states are patriarchal, but and extremely so in some parts of the Middle East and North Africa. But we also were aware that not all states are equally patriarchal. So the challenges had to do with all the challenges that all of you have discussed. And then I think some were more prominent in different disciplines. So in sociology, those were two things that we had to confront and debunk.
Yeah, thank you, Maya. Thank you, all of you. I mean, I just, for myself, sort of remembering the differences in terms of how it has translated. When I was a graduate student, I remember going to MESA, the Middle East Studies Association conference, and I would go to these panels about Iraq or about Palestine and Lebanon. It was all men talking about it. And then I was part of the feminist panel that was often referred to as a ladies panel. And as feminists, we would go to the all-man panels and would always ask the question, what about gender? And they would look uncomfortable, but they would never come to our panels. But I feel like that has changed. So certainly there is some shift, in terms of just the, who is attending what and who is talking at what panels. But Maya, over to you now.
Thank you for that, that conversation. That was really wonderful. And I just want to echo Nadje and say I'm really honored to be here with you, all of you, and in conversation with all of you. And to everyone who observes here and in the audience, also Ramadan Kareem. So we're going to now, and Nadje, I'm not sure, and hopefully things have changed a lot, but we'll see under conversation. So we're gonna shift a little bit now to think, and some of you've all kind of addressed this in your previous answers, but moving the focus maybe a little bit towards each of your personal journeys, and to ask here and here, we've all already heard some really the names of some wonderful feminist scholars, but who has really sort of influenced your thinking? Who and that can be, of totally different generations. And within that, what are in your careers, what are sort of the key questions that you've been interested in, and how have they shifted? You've already spoken a little bit to sort of how our work is in constant dialogue with a region that is in turmoil all the time. But how has your work sort of shifted throughout your careers? And then finally, part of that, and we would be remiss not to ask this question, what are some of the challenges that each of you have faced? And how have you learned from those challenges, and what have you taken from them? So we're going to start here with Suad, if that's all right.
Sure, thank you. I have to say how delighted I am to be with this group of scholars with whom I have shared so much history. I mean, we have really been on a journey together. Deniz and I met, I can't even remember, count the years. We probably should be celebrating our 50th anniversary. And Judith, we go way back. And Maya, I know you back from San Diego days. I remember when you were coming up for tenure, having conversations. And Nadje and Maya, you give me such hope for the generations that are coming up now. So I just have to say that because I'm really very moved just by looking at this screen. I have to say, I mean, your questions are wonderful. They're ones that I think about a lot because I'm puzzled by my own history, often very confused is not the word, but very puzzled by how I got to where I am. There was nothing that could have predicted that. In my earlier years, I have to say, I was very unformed theoretically when I began graduate school. To the degree that I had any theoretical grounding, it was mainly Durkheimian and Marxian. But I was at Columbia during the 1968 strike, and that was an incredibly transformative moment. So it was not any person, it was the events, and it was being a part of that student movement. And I was part of SDS, and then the falling out of the madness the SDS became, which is another whole story I could talk about another time. But the key variables were always class and the state. I mean, I took to the field with me the commitment to understanding the state, the commitment to understanding class. I was not a feminist when I went to do field work. What made me into a feminist was my field work, because I came back from the field and I realized that overwhelmingly my data was about women and I had to understand it. So I started asking people, who do I talk to? How do I understand this data? And I was simultaneously asked to teach a course on what was then called sex roles. I was at Hofstra University at the time. And I was led to Raina Ryder, who is now known better as Raina Rapp. And she introduced me to a whole group of Marxist feminists. Well, I was already a Marxist, so that was an easy transition. So it was people like Raina, like Gail Rubin, like Louise Lamphere, like Karen Sachs. We were reading together, we were writing together, we were thinking together, and none of them were of the Middle East. I mean, that was the vacuum for me, is that where all of my intellectual inspiration was occurring was not occupied, was not inhabited by scholars of the Middle East domestically. Of course, there was Deniz in England, but there were very few in anthropology who were doing this kind of work at that time. So then I came to Davis, and there was no one doing the Middle East here. I was literally the only one regularly teaching the Middle East at Davis. So there's very few people to talk with. So I would go to the Bay Area where there was a Middle East seminar, but there weren't feminists among those. So I couldn't bring the two fields together, Marxism and feminism. So I guess I took a path that was left some history to it, which is that I just decided that if I couldn't find people to talk with around Marxism and feminism, about women in the Middle East, about the Middle East even at all, then I had to create organizations to do that. And what followed was several decades in which every time a question would come up, I wanted to find people to work with. I created an organization to do that. Nadje mentioned the Association for Middle East Women's Studies, but that was preceded by the Middle East section of the American Anthropological Association, which I started when I was still a graduate student at Columbia, because there was no one to talk to within anthropology. And a panel that we had suggested was rejected, and that panel had Carl Wittfogel on it. And I learned that you couldn't be a graduate student in the Anthropology Association and bring someone like Carl Wittfogel, because he had been blackballed during the 1950s congressional hearings. But the following year, after our panel was rejected, the American Anthropological Association brought Carl Wittfogel. They just didn't want graduate students to do it. So I created an organization, the Middle East section of the American Anthropological Association. Then came the Association for Middle East Studies, the Association for Middle East Women's Studies. We started the Women's Studies program at Davis in the 1980s. There was no one to talk with about families, which is an area that I was increasingly interested in. So I created the Arab Families Working Group. Then I wanted to get scholars in Lebanon talking with scholars here. So the consortium, I created a consortium called the University of California Davis Arab Region Consortium that included AUB and AUC and LAU and Bir Zayed. And then the Arab American Studies Association co-founded that, and on and on. As a result, I never published a book because I was spending the whole time creating these organizations that provided enormous gratification and networks. And of course, the latest one was the Middle East South Asia Studies program at Davis. But what ran through all of that work was, for me, class and state. I think I've never moved from being interested in, no matter what issue I took up, I somehow always looped back to connecting with class and the state. I was born in a country with a very weak state, then I grew up in a country that was a very strong state, and going back and forth between the two always struck me. And so when I studied women, then women's networks, then family, and then citizenship, then this led me to the study of looking at rights and the self. All of those produced kind of a bundle of concepts that continue to loop back to the state, the weak state, the sectarian state, whether it was starting from the beginning of the politicization of religion to looking at the notion of connectivity and the relational self, the relational rights. Somehow the state and class was always the key variable in it. And now, in the backdrop of all of those transformations, where what I mentioned earlier, the violence, and now we see the genocide in Palestine, had led me to bring those pieces together to look at the concept of trauma and how we can develop a concept of trauma that is useful and appropriate and relevant in these conditions, in Palestine, in Lebanon, in Syria. I think we have to have a whole different framework and understanding in a place there's no such thing as a post-traumatic stress, but there is no post. The trauma is ongoing, it's generational, it's societal, it's not individual, it's societal. We need a whole different approach. And somehow all of those pieces are connected, leading from the initial work on politicization of religion in the state to the notion of looking at how women acted in that, to looking at the family, to looking at the notions of relationality, all connected with WASTA and networks, for somehow that bundle produced itself. I really did not go out to study any of this. I didn't have a framework in mind other than class and state. They kind of, I believe that in my case, the field led me. I don't think I led the field. It was what was emerging that I felt I had to address in some way. So that's a brief history of the questions that interested me and the conditions that brought those questions forward.
Thank you, Suad. I think this brings up such an important point, which is so much of the work we do is actually the work of the academy, right? It's building infrastructures. Its knowledge production is also about building the capacity for knowledge production. And also it's teaching, right? So much of, and on that note, I want to move it to my former professor, Professor Judith Tucker, to also chime in on these questions.
Thanks, Maya. And I mean, I was taught more than I taught, let's say, by people like you. So, yeah, I think Suad's point about experience, how experience sometimes is just as powerful and influential as any given individual. So in my case, like Suad, I was active in the anti-war movement on campus in 68, 69, but that wasn't really what propelled me, I think, because after I finished college, I went to Beirut for 2 years, and it was during the time of when the Palestinian Revolution was fully ensconced there and in sort of in flower, I would say. And what struck me is I remember being so struck by women and kind of a certain rhetoric about how important women were in this revolutionary movement. Now, I'm not saying that the reality always lived up to the to the posters and to the discussion, but I mean, coming from the U.S. left, I thought, wow, this is so much better than what I'm used to in terms of how the left deals with issues of women's participation, etc. So I became very interested in those days, gender wasn't a word we used. So in that sense, so I became very interested in women's history as a result, and women's history in the Middle East as a result. I think largely of that experience, but I mean, I did do my original work in Egypt, however, because well, of various reasons that are not very important, but yeah, and the journey was really one of, as you know, as I mentioned before, starting very squarely based in political economy, and I think also perhaps one of the reasons I was a historian is, and what has really shaped the field of history of Middle East women's and gender history has been the recognition of the importance in the modern period of the imperial and the colonial, and how much that has shaped, everybody, right, and everything, and that goes from the individual right up, of course, to the state, and our need to really study that process very carefully, and it's of course, many of the historical studies of the ways in which empire deployed gender in various ways are still so relevant to what happens today. So I think that's certainly one great consideration. I think, as I said, my own. I mean, I kind of fell into what I ended up doing a little bit for my subsequent projects because I, worked in the court records, the Islamic court records, and as you know, they became such an important source for studies of women and gender, particularly in Ottoman times in the region. And I worked in them very uncritically in the beginning, just mining them for data. And then I became curious ultimately about sort of, okay, so, what's really going on here? Why Islamic law? Why the courts? Why are these things? What lies behind this? And so then I got interested in a much broader study of Islamic law itself, Islamic law and gender issues, Islamic law and society. What was that historical trajectory? And I ultimately, how do we understand the really epistemological break that we see between as we move into the modern state, taking control and codifying the law and so forth. So it also, I got in through the back door into issues of state as well. Yeah. So I think that's in a nutshell how I ended. Oh, I would just add one more thing, perhaps, in reflection about how much we are influenced by, by what's going on the ground. And of course, as so I pointed out, it's been a very violent time, and I did, and that encouraged me to look at the issue of piracy in the 18th century as just kind of what are the, how was gendered violence, what did it look like in an earlier time, right, in the region? So, that's, I think, some of the major influences for me.
Thank you. Maya or Deniz, we'd love to hear you also on these questions.
Which one do you want to go?
Well, you're unmuted, so now it's on you.
Okay. I think that I see two things that influence my thinking. First of all, I'm from Tunisia. I grew up in Tunisia. I went to college at the Sorbonne in Paris and then in graduate school in the US. And wherever I was, women from other parts of the Middle East and North Africa would come to me and say, "Oh, how lucky you are to be from Tunisia. Women in Tunisia have rights that no other country has." So I met that wherever I went. Then in graduate school, I was plunged in the study of comparative historical sociology. I was in a department where you could do quantitative work or you could do comparative historical work, basically. There was very little ethnography at the time in that department. So I was very drawn to comparative historical sociology. And I think because I'm a woman from Tunisia, several people on the faculty and elsewhere expected me to do as a dissertation a study of illustrating women's subordination somewhere in a community or in families in Tunisia. And as stubborn as I was and interested as I was in comparative historical sociology, I wanted to understand big developments in the region, and the methodology that I had learned had been applied to issues of wars, revolution, political systems, democracy, dictatorship, and so on. And so I thought, well, how about gender? How about women? How about women's rights? How do those long-term broad developments impact women's rights? So that's what I wanted to study. And the reaction I got was, wow, you're using a big gun to shoot a small bird. And my reaction was, hey, no, women's rights, that's not a small bird, that's a big bird. So I am using big guns to understand big birds. And so that's how I got into the study of the development of states. And when I did that, then I found another challenge, and that was how you study states in the region. And the relationship between class and state was at the center of the scholarship on the development of states. And, you know, growing up in a colonial, post-colonial situation where elite schools were teaching French, and thus I learned French history and very little history of Tunisia. But when I looked at the history of Tunisia, and Algeria and Morocco, I found that the development of states had to do not only with the class, state, class governance, class rulers relationship, but also with how states related to what I have called kin-based solidarities, to groups that are organized and along kinship lines and held together by a sense of belonging to a common kinship line, a common ancestor, and not necessarily by social class. And so that's how I ended up developing step by step, first, you know, looking at women's rights in my dissertation, and then later on developing the sense, an analysis of how states emerged and changed historically, going the very, very long term from the pre-colonial period to the post-colonial period. And that's where I really sort of held on to that, with many people telling me, well, what's this strange idea of looking at kinship? Why are you looking at that? And so I argued that I was looking at kinship because I thought that there were groups that were resisting the state, or on the contrary, allying themselves with the state, that were based on kinship, and that since these groups were patriarchal, it had something to do with how women's rights developed. And, you know, I was really surprised because just 2 days ago, I read an article about Hamas and how it is relating to the population and organizing the population. And of course, not surprisingly, kin groupings come into play, kinship comes into play in how those groups are held together. And Hamas is I mean, I can't even remember the source, and I don't know how reliable it is, but Hamas is totally aware of the significance of what brings people together and holds them together, particularly in situations of violence and trauma and destruction and so on. So those two things, you know, is what sort of brought my work together. And I think, just to mention very briefly how my interests have changed, I think I have gone from wanting to study structures and states and broad institutions to a focus in my current work on agency. Now I want to understand how women's movements, feminist movements, develop and survive in situations where it's not easy to survive, what strategies they use to survive, and to find a voice when conditions permit. So my shift really has been from structure to agency, and I can say a little more about why I think I want to study that now when we, in our last question, talk about where issues in the future.
Right. It was all fascinating. And I think it will seem very unacademic to say that my formative experience was growing up in Istanbul as a girl, actually. I mean, it may seem strange that you can have a 9-year-old proto-feminist, but that's exactly what happened. And all the inspiration for my work on patriarchy was formed when I was in primary school, basically. But my work took off in the 1980s. I left Turkey and came to London in the 80s, and I was confronted by two sets of scholarship that gave rise to great dissatisfaction. One was feminist scholarship itself, which, as you might remember, was then dominated by big debates about capitalism and patriarchy. So you had radical feminists, socialist feminists, liberal feminists battling it out, trying to decide whether these were independent systems of oppression, whether they worked together. And of course, my own experiences of being on the ground and seeing how women were actually coping day to day with living in patriarchal structures led me to bargaining with patriarchy, basically, where I was arguing that each system of male dominance creates its own areas of wiggle room and different forms of consciousness, conservative consciousness, and so on. And that is much more relevant, actually, than I imagined, because I thought the particular patriarchal bargain I was talking about, which was based on women's obedience and submission for male protection, seems to have quite a few buyers among Trump-supporting women, apparently, as we see in your latest election. So in relation to feminist theory, that was my main contribution. And in relation to the Middle East, I was extremely frustrated by what seemed a very sterile approach to women's rights in the region. And this is what motivated me to do Women, Islam, and the State. Because, you know, I was actually quite interested in how histories of state formation and nationalism inflected the ways in which Islam came into the picture. And indeed, I drew on Maya's work at that point, who was doing her PhD, which was a comparative study of Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. So basically, these were the two kind of axes. But what happened is that as I got more involved in scholarship in the United States, etc., I started really feeling rather desperate about the sterility of the film. We seemed to be stuck in a groove of trying to, we were back again, you know, as if the state moment had never happened, discussing Islamic feminism. Everybody had suddenly become a Muslim scholar, etc., etc. And also, I think the Zionist, anti-Zionist axis in politics, which was much sharper in the United States, drove me to despair. And I simply made a cowardly exit from the field. I started working in Central Asia. So from 95 to 2000, I was in Uzbekistan. And then I started working on Afghanistan. However, what drew me back to the field was the Arab uprisings. At that point, I was already retired, and I was working for a webzine called Open Democracy, where I was supposed to be monitoring the gender effects of the Arab uprisings, which was great. because it gave me the opportunity to give a platform to my friends who were in the region to write about that moment from Cairo, from Tunisia, and of course from the environing countries, Saudi Arabia, Iran. I am missing an Iranian colleague on this panel. That's just the parenthesis. But at that point, I realized that my model of patriarchy was outdated, that it needed urgent revision, because what I thought I was seeing on the ground with respect to the sorts of violence that were being deployed, gender-based violence, were new patterns. What I was talking about was usually the kind of violence that takes place in families, in communities, in tribes, where everything is hushed up. This was public and it was state-led in many places. So I moved away from patriarchy and coined the term masculinist restoration, saying that basically masculinist restoration is what happens when hegemony starts cracking up and you have new forms of political consciousness. Now, I was very influenced by what was happening in the Middle East, what was happening in Tahrir, in Cairo, what was happening in Istanbul during the Gezi uprisings. And what I saw was a newer generation who were aware that gender issues were actually about governance. You know, that it wasn't about men, women, sexualities, that it was about the desire for a pluralistic democratic society vis-a-vis the patriarchal pretensions of autocracies. So my idea at the time was that there would be new cross-gender alliances, so that it wasn't about, in other words, it was about politics. You would have groups of men and women fighting for democracy, for pluralism, for inclusivity, and men and women fighting against it. Okay, that was my model, which of course crumbled totally in view of the rise of right-wing movements across Europe and in the United States. One part of it totally vindicated my masculinist restoration idea, because we had it on display, you know, a full display, you know, when a candidate starts courting incels, you know, men who are known for extreme misogynistic views. What does that mean, you know? So we started seeing, and of course, then the statistics followed. And what the statistics were showing was a clear gender gap in political preferences. So in the States, there was a major gap between young men, we're talking 18 to 24, between men and women, with more men voting for Trump than women. The same pattern emerged in Germany with the statistics that came out of the people who voted for Alternative für Deutschland. And we see this pattern all over. Now, I don't want to take too much time, but I refused to treat this by resorting to the concept of backlash that you're all familiar with in political science. The idea that when empowered groups start affecting policies on the ground, aggrieved majorities who feel disempowered lash back and try to claw back whatever rights, whatever spaces they may have acquired. The reason I refuse to do that is because I think it prevents us from looking at feminism and feminist approaches more critically. And there are two things. First of all, I was very critical about the way in which gender was incorporated through governance tools, shall we say. But then this critique of, you know, how gender mainstreaming was incorporated in the Middle East, how it became a fig leaf for very autocratic governments just doing sort of gestures towards, you know, inclusivity of women. But I think that this was really, really insufficient, because we have to address the way in which the Western canon itself was actually disseminated in the region. And I think that also led us into a cul-de-sac. Remember, I said at the beginning that every field of study in the West was influenced by social movements. And of course, the field of gender and sexualities was greatly influenced by the LGBT movement in the West. There was a whole debate which had material consequences, policy consequences, like who has the right to marry, who has the right to adopt children, who inherits what, do children have the right to assign their own gender, etc. This was not at all the case in the Middle East. This did not prevent the wholesale dissemination of concepts that were generated in Northern California to Kabul. I'm saying Kabul because I happened to be in Afghanistan at the time where gender trainers were telling Afghan women who'd come out of Taliban rule and who could not leave their home without a mahram, that gender was a fluid concept. I remember the expression on their faces, the incomprehension, because in cases where gender identities are coerced and indeed enforced by police measures, these concepts as training material created immense difficulties. Now, what I'm interested in at the moment is revising masculinist restoration, because I think that concept has now reached its limit. We are now in a situation where the crisis of social reproduction throughout the world has reached such proportions that you have a genuine crisis with birth rates, with people accepting to get into alliances. What does it mean when one of the most patriarchal societies in the world, South Korea, has the lowest birth rate in the world? What does it mean when South Korea has the most radical feminist movement? 4B, literally gender apartheid, no men, okay? I think that we are witnessing a moment of crisis in the gender regime globally. Now, the situation in the Middle East is, of course, much more dire because this is overlain by a layer of atrocity that precludes a discussion of gender, I think. I think that right now, you would have to be a very brave person to ask, well, where does Hamas stand on these issues? Okay. I think that we have reached a point where analytic inquiry, asking questions has become so difficult because things are so toxic and so polarized. In the 90s, I could run away from the Middle East. And the places I ran away to, I can assure you, were no better. Now, there's nowhere to run. So literally, because what I'm talking about is not just a Middle East problem, but a global problem, which brings me back to Nadje's first question. Why does a gender lens matter? A gender lens now is not about women's rights, gay rights, men, women. It's about different political blocs with different aims and the prospect of being able to form. So gender has become a key mobilizing issue. Think of Iran. Think of the demonstrations, Women, Life, Freedom. They started in 22. They were barely able to put them down a year later using massive repression. And this was the galvanizing issue that drove people into the streets. Men knew that this wasn't about women veiling or unveiling. This was about the sort of regime they would live under. They knew that protesting against the oppression of women was a protest against the regime type they were living under. And this was clearly articulated by these participants. So now, what I would like to explore is, do we really understand this moment correctly? Do we really know what's going on? And what are the elements of hope? How can we form an agenda that can mobilize those forces that are able to act as a counterweight against the various forms of autocracy that are germinating everywhere in their own way. And of course, how do we understand the global alliances, you know, that form around gender, which are now much broader? Yeah, basically that's it.
So, I mean, Maya and I have so many questions, but we're mindful of time and we're saying that the audience put in some questions. I just, before actually starting to read out a couple of audience questions, I just wanted to add, I mean, Deniz, over the years, we've been in conversation, and one of the things that, so Deniz was my professor, by the way, so I'm, you know, particularly happy to be in conversation with her, but with all of you, of course. So this idea that we really have to rethink our categories when we speak about the world, the West, the Middle East, the global South, and so on, doesn't make sense anymore when, you know, we can't talk anymore about the West being the stronghold for challenging patriarchy and heteronormativity. I mean, far from it. And if anything, actually, we see that far-right politics everywhere in the world is sort of employing this anti-genderism, anti-feminism, and homophobic holding on to heteronormativity. And that actually really forces us to rethink the way we think, we talk about different forms of feminisms. Okay, but now thank you, those of you in the audience, and I know there are many of you, and actually many of you who are in the field and important. I've noticed Miriam Cook is joining us. We've already mentioned Julie Petit, Homa Hutfa. Many of those that we are referring to are also in the audience. So Rania Maktabi, her comment is, Mounira Charrad pointed out that sociology is a latecomer to the field of gender studies in the Middle East. I wonder what the panelists think about the discipline of political science. Has it ever made it? Suad Joseph emphasized the importance of exploring the significance of chronic violence in the region. What would the panelists request from political science scholars to address with reference to gender studies in a chronologically traumatized Middle East? How could we as scholars contribute to studying how and where women are located in relation to power? And I'm going to read out a second question, and I'm going to ask you, you know, you don't have to answer all of them, but, you know, a couple of minutes, maybe react to one or the other. Samira Damavandi is asking, she's thanking you all, and she is wondering if you could speak to the concept of state feminism, state-sponsored feminism in the Middle East. Who'd like to start? Maybe, well, Maya, because your work is mentioned directly in the beginning, maybe we'll start with you. Yes.
Well, it's many different questions. So I think on political science, there is certainly a flurry of scholarship right now. And, you know, a lot of it is focused on the place of women in political institutions. The sort of dominant theme of research has to do with women in parliaments, women in positions of power, women at the head of institutions of many kinds. It came to study gender in the Middle East, I think, probably pretty much in the same way as sociology. I would say both political science and sociology were latecomers compared to anthropology and history. And I just want to say a word about state feminism, because when I did my comparative work, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, and tried to explain why some states were inclined to expand women's rights, when other states preferred to curtail women's rights or chose those policies, then clearly the concept of state feminism was relevant to the case of Tunisia, where the state engaged in policies that were favorable to women in terms of law, family law, for reasons of its own interests. And the reasons why states will be inclined to promote rights of women or rights of any marginalized group can have to do with responding to a social movement or have to do with their own interests. So state feminism, I think, is when states find that it is better for them to promote women's rights. And it can be better for them because of the system of alliances in the country, that they are allied with forces that are also more inclined to confront patriarchy, whatever those groups might be. Or it can be because it's beneficial on the international scene to look like a champion of women's rights. And there are states that have engaged in policies in favor of women's rights for reasons of wanting to look like champions of those policies on internationally, because there was a time, which may not be now, but not so long ago, where to receive funding from the European Union, from the United States, you had, as a state, you had to show that at least you were lenient towards issues of women's rights, or you had to maintain a discourse that appeared to be promoting women's rights. So I think state feminism seems to have been a feature of an earlier period on the global scene, like Deniz was talking about. And I think we see much less of it right now, given the political shifts that have occurred most recently. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Suad, would you like to contribute as well? But very briefly, we now have 12 questions. We're not going to be able to address all of them, but I was hoping to give many a chance. So Suad?
Sure. Renya's question is very pointed and timely. I would put economics in the same kind of pool with political science. I think they both are highly quantitative and modeling oriented, and what they tend to do is exactly what Maya suggested. But I would look outside of those disciplines and what would compel them to address issues on the ground. And what I see, building on Deniz's very broad analysis, is that what I've been seeing for a few years, and I've actually been saying a few years, I think we're in a historically transformative moment. When you see extremes on all sides radicalized and empowered and moving, that is a signal of transformative moments. I lived through a transformative moment in the 60s that ended up getting wasted, I believe, in some ways. I think we're another transformative moment, and we're living it in the United States. You cannot get much more extreme in a country that calls itself a democracy. But we're seeing it all over Europe, and we're seeing it in much of the Middle East. I think those disciplines will have to address what is happening on the ground and what is going to happen. We don't have the privilege of seeing and predicting, but it feels very much to me like we are in a period that is going to change the whole world around us. And it's not just because of the elections in the United States. I think this has been bubbling up to the surface for years now, and we will see what's going to come forward from it. I think, you just look at what's happening in the Middle East. The settler colonialism, the genocide, every site I'm working on, people are leaving. I started a study in 1975. The people who were there are not there. Their children are not there. I started a study in 1993 in the village. The people I was starting to study are not there. They're leaving. I started a study in Iraq in 1980, then the Iran-Iraq war. that kind of turmoil, that kind of constant upheaval cannot be sustained without major transformations happening. And I think the disciplines are going to have to wake up and look at what is happening on the ground. In other words, I am once more driven by what's on the ground.
Right, I suggest we go over to the next couple of questions, Maya.
Yeah, we have so many wonderful questions here that you can all see. I'm just going to sort of take a cluster for you. So the first is from, and there are many. The first is from Kelly Hanavi. Thank you all for your insights and important contributions. What do you hope for the future of this field, and where do you hope the field will go from here? I also wanted to ask this because this sort of leads from Suad's last point, Nathalie Al-Eid. Thanks so much for this incredible conversation. What are the politics of conducting research about increasingly traumatized peoples during increasingly catastrophic times for the region? We also have a question from Jaspir Poir. Thank you. What a beautiful, rich conversation. Thank you. This deep dive has been amazing. I'm thinking about Deniz's last comment on the global right-wing attacks on gender and wondering about the centrality of abjecting and enacting violence towards transgender people in order to reinforce gender binarism, and here including, obviously, in the Middle East, and increasingly so in the Middle East. Would love to hear your thoughts on these connections, since gender and trans, and I would add sexuality in the fields that you are in. And this is the last one I will add that's sort of here, which is from Wazma Osman, about how do we build alliances between Middle East feminist studies in regards to citation practices? How does that enter the coalitions and the sort of feminist knowledge production that we're producing? Very small questions, so go ahead.
Well, maybe if I could just jump in and talk a little bit about how I see the future of the field, because perhaps it's a little bit more of a positive view. I mean, just probably we all feel this way, but there's so much great scholarship being done at the moment. So it's certainly in the field of history, and I think it's expanded into areas, and women's and gender studies has been very central to this kind of expansion into areas that deal with race, that deal with space, that really are very the body. I mean, just very, very rich research being done, and a real expansion of the sort of the agenda for the field, certainly of history. So that is a good thing, and we can feel good about that. I mean, I think another thing we can feel good about is I feel we are much better connected. I mean, even though the world is so the world we're inhabiting is so difficult, as everybody has pointed out, but still we're very well connected across spaces, and that's largely, I think, a result of the kind of internet revolution and the ways in which we can keep in touch with our counterparts in other parts of the world much more easily than we used to be able to. So that's a good thing too, I think, because I think the concerns of our colleagues, who are in Gaza, or who are in the West Bank, or who are in Egypt or Syria or whatever, we hear them in ways, we can hear them in ways that we couldn't before. We can keep in touch in ways that we couldn't before. So I think the last point I would make is that, of course, for all of us, in terms of, there was a question raised about research and the doing of research and some of the barriers that we face. And in terms of doing research in the field of history, it has become, because the area has seen such a high level of violence, and because the states have become more authoritarian. There's been so many restrictions in terms of doing research. You can't get into archives, you can't perhaps even travel to the country you plan to, et cetera, et cetera. That's, that's obviously been very challenging. It's also been very, I think, productive in a way, because people have expanded the concept of archives and have thought in very creative and interesting new ways about what constitutes an archive. That's really opened up, like, the body itself is an archive, or historical memory is an archive. I mean, there are different ways that we can do our research. And as just a final point, I want to say something about, in response to the question, the trans question that was raised, and point out that we actually have in the history field some really great insights into how questions of transgendered people were thought about in the past. So I point you to Sada Skalenga's work on the body, and the way in which 18th century thinkers in Ottoman Syria, basically were highly aware and interested in this question, and really had some very helpful things to say about it.
Anyone else would like to answer?
Right. I'll just make a comment about Natalie Reid's question about what kind of research can be done under conditions of political violence, and maybe direct you to an edited book called The Politics of Engaged Gender Research that I co-edited with Zaina Zatari and Lina Miari. And all of the articles were written by scholars in the region, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Tunisia, and so forth, who are dealing with repressive regimes and doing research in those regimes. And it gives you a tremendous insight how indigenous, local, feminist research is being conducted, and the difficulties. They talk about surveillance, they talk about mukhabarat, and so forth. And it's connected to that, I want to pick up on Judith's wonderful point, which I think is actually, this is a hopeful moment. I see transformative moments as very hopeful moments. They are a call for action. They are a call for activism. They are a call for the public intellectual. Particularly, I mean, the work that Nadje is doing, the work that Maya is doing. I'll boast about my own students, Nina Mayadi, Nadine Neber, Zaina Zatari, Shireen Hafiz. There's generations of young scholars being emerging that are doing themselves historically transformative work in a historically transformative moment. So I see enormous possibilities. And this is a time, I think, for good scholars to come into the field of Middle East women's studies, because the possibilities are endless. And young, how should I say this? The field needs you. Join us.
May I add something to
Yes,
follow up on?
Yes, yes.
To answer that question? Yeah, I agree with Suad. It's a moment of amazing possibility, also probably of great transformations. Some are still to come. And speaking sort of more from my field, I see three possibilities for sort of expanding what we're doing. Some have implications for activism, and some less so. It seems to me that something I want to understand a lot better than I do at the moment is the activism of women in the region, agency of women, how women in the region or in each country come together to express their agency and to organize themselves. And what they're doing is really not a photocopy, in my opinion, of what has occurred in other parts of the world necessarily, for reasons that have to do with history, culture, forms of governance, context, and so on. So the work I am trying to do now is to look at how women have come together collectively, not only expressing agency in their individual private lives, but how do they manage to come together? Because there is a big difference between individual agency and collective agency in terms of what it can do to the social political environment. So that's one thing that I think is really important. Another is that I think given the violence in the country, some issue that Suad mentioned early on, looking at trauma, a crying question is how do people survive? For those who survive, how do they survive? How do communities, families, groups survive under conditions of trauma? What is it that's giving them the strength? What is it that's allowing them to come together to survive? How come they don't just end up all in a chaotic world killing each other? So what are the mechanisms for survival, for managing trauma in those parts of the world? And then at the academic level, what I would like to see happen, and I know a lot of wonderful research is happening. I think, along with someone who made a comment in the questions written here, I think we need to participate and contribute more to the general discourse in our disciplines. I find that sometimes of what's done in Middle East studies is defined as Middle East studies, and then there is social theory somewhere, and social theory is not what we do. Social theory is what people who study the Western world do, whether it's the US and Western Europe, and maybe a little bit Russia. And I think that we have been, as a field, generally marginalized, and I would like to explode those boundaries and make our work part of the social theory that all social scientists will consider, whether they're working on the Middle East or other parts of the world. And I think we still have a long way to go to get there.
Yeah, but ironically, given the current political moment, not just in the US, but also in many other European countries, this might actually be a time when those of us who have worked on authoritarianism and political repression and the centrality of gender, that we are actually at the forefront of thinking through some of these themes and can actually provide some not just empirical examples, but theoretical and political suggestions and solidarity. But very sadly, I have to say we have to wrap up. I mean, we can, of course, go on for hours. This is so interesting. And of course, we haven't been able to cover so many issues, and there's still 15 questions in the Q&A. I know some of you asked for a transcript, and some of you asked whether there's a recording available. There will be a recording, and there will be a transcript linked to a MERIP issue that is forthcoming. So hold on, you'll be able to have that and also share it with your friends and colleagues. But at this moment, I'd just like to thank everyone. Again, thank the team at MERIP. Thank all of you and Maya, Judith, Maya, Suad, and Deniz for this wonderful panel. Thank you. And also many thanks to the audience. We had many of you who participated and listened to us. So thanks.
Thanks to you. Thanks to you.
Thank you.
Everybody. Yeah, so good to see everybody.